Hey friends, welcome back to the Adventures of Blink. I am of course Blink and you can find me on GitHub right here. Now, before we go any further, I want to make sure you're clicking like and subscribe. The like gives me the feedback to know that you're enjoying the content you see. So if you're enjoying it, if you're getting something out of it, hit the button just to let me know that I hit the mark on this one. That helps me understand what kind of content is good and what's not so good. And I'll try to keep the not so good stuff out in the future. And then, of course, the subscribe button just means that you're not going to miss any upcoming episodes. And the way that our seasons work here on the Adventures of Blink is that they're contiguous stories. Like each season tells an entire story. That's the way I've encapsulated it. So if you're jumping into this is episode 4 in the season, for instance, you want to make sure that you're not missing out on any of the rest of the season because we're going to build on what we learned today. So, what exactly are we going to learn for today? Well, today builds on the last couple of episodes where we've been learning to use Git. Now, everything we've done so far has allowed us to use Git to manage the changes to our code, but we haven't actually tapped into one of the most powerful aspects of using Git, and that's collaborative coding. So today we're going to be looking at how to get our code, our Git repository, from our local computer into both GitHub and GitLab to be served out and shared among anybody who wants to use them. As it turns out, we can actually do this in both places from the same local folder. So what we're going to do is start here with GitHub. All right, so here we are on my GitHub profile page. Yours might look a little different, of course, because you'll have your own stuff there and you can customize it in a few different ways. But suffice to say, this is where we are. This is sort of the jumping off point for today. We're going to go up here to create a new repository. The first option on the create a new repository page is to use a template. We're not going to do that today, but suffice to say, it's a really powerful feature that allows you to create sort of boilerplate applications. If you were a freelance website designer, for instance, and each of your customers would come and request that you build a website, and you always use the same framework because that's the one that you know really well and you're comfortable with, you could build a template with that framework already pre-installed so that you have all of the basics done and you can just start customizing for the customer at that point. It's a handy feature to have there if you need it, but it's not something we're going to use today. So we'll go on down here to owner and we can see I am the owner. If you work for a company that uses GitHub to hold their organization code, you might be part of an organization group here where you could drop down and pick the company name out of it as well. But most of us are probably just going to see our own name there, our own personal repository is where this is going to live. And we have to name each repository. Now the name has to be unique for your profile or for the organization profile if that's where you're putting it. So whatever it is, it's within that namespace that you have to keep it. And all I'm going to do for this one is s3e4 for season 3 episode 4. I've obviously not done that before, so we have a new thing there. We could put in a description. This is episode 4's repository. It'd be nice if I knew how to spell, right? So if you mark your repository as public, it's going to be available to anyone on the internet, but you can choose to add collaborators to your project who would be allowed to do direct commits. Everyone else is going to have to do what's called forking and submit back a PR if they want to make a change. But those will always go through you to approve. If you set up committers, on the other hand, who are collaborators on your project, they'll be able to make direct changes without necessarily your approval. It depends on what you want there. On the other hand, if you choose private, you're going to find that no one can see this repository except you until you add them to it as a collaborator. Okay, so as we scroll down here, you can see some other options. You can add a README file and a gitignore and a license directly into your Git repository when you're creating it inside of GitHub. These are just added features that are available to kind of make things easier because generally speaking, the flow of work is I'm ready to create a Git repository, so I go to GitHub and I open a repository there, and then I clone it locally to start doing work on it. as opposed to what we've done over the last couple of episodes, which was build it all locally, and now we're going to look for a way to push it up to the repository. The short version of this is I'm not going to add any of these files today, but I usually do. So it's important to know that the options are there. In this case, because we have code locally and we're trying to push it up, it's going to cause an automatic merge conflict if we then try to push our new or our local repository into our new GitHub repository and we created new files in it. They're not in sync, and so we instantly have a big merge conflict problem to resolve. Let's skip over that just by leaving them blank. So once you've created a blank repository in GitHub, it brings you to this page that has some details on how you can use your new Git repository, but obviously it doesn't show you any file structure or anything because that doesn't exist. You created an empty repository. So we're going to set this aside for just a moment, and we're going over to GitLab, where we're going to create a new project and kind of walk through the same thing. Now remember, we're in two separate tools here. We looked at GitHub, and now we're looking at GitLab. So we're going to create a blank project, and we're going to call this Season 3, Episode 4, just like we did on the other side. We are going to put this in my blank user space. And then there's a project slug, which would be generally speaking, we want to keep that the same as the project name. I think there's probably some different things you can do there, but generally speaking, it's probably safest to keep them the same. The deployment target, we are not currently planning a deployment. If you notice, the options there are I'm going to publish to Kubernetes, or I'm going to put it on Heroku, or I might be running it in a virtual machine like on Amazon EC2, or I might be creating a mobile app, and so the mobile app is going to compile and get published to the App Store. There's lots of options there. I could even be doing a GitLab Pages, which allows me to actually create static websites based on a GitLab repository and publish it directly such that people can come here and see my static website. But in this case, all I'm going to do is store some code and push some things back and forth. So I'm going to do that. Now we've got visibility levels. There's 3 to pick here. I can use private, which means just like private did in GitHub, means everybody has to be explicitly added to this repository in order to work in it. And then, of course, if the project is part of a group of projects that you can create over here in the Groups tab, then access would be granted to all the members of the group. Internal means that anybody who's logged in, except for external users, can use this repository. So it gives you a little bit more a little bit more exposure without too much risk. And then public is just like the GitHub public, which says it's available for everyone out there to be able to view the repository and do stuff. So you have some options down here as far as things you want to add on to the project, similar to what we saw on the GitHub page. But the options are a little different. First of all, there's the README, which actually does match up. So if we wanted to add a README automatically into the project, we would do that. We're, of course, making this blank just like we did before, so that we have easy push abilities. So I'm not going to check that. Now, the other option here is a really intriguing sort of divergence from what we saw in GitHub. In GitLab, we're trying to build a full continuous delivery system. And we talked about continuous delivery in a previous episode. I think it was, it might have just been a blog post if you look back in like the first season of The Adventures of Blink, where we talked about different DevOps principles. One of them is continuous delivery, continuous integration. These are usually referred to as CI and CD. But the idea is that we start building in all of the automation that allows us to deliver our code instantly when we finish writing it. So enable static application security testing, SAST. This is a really cool feature that's built into GitLab that allows you to analyze your source code for known security vulnerabilities. So if you're using a library that's known to be vulnerable to some sort of attack, GitLab will actually flag it for you in the process and say, hey, wait a second, I noticed that you're using this. You need to upgrade to a version where that's been patched. Stuff like that to help you along. Could be a really valuable thing. Of course, in today's adventure, we're not doing any of that in extended setup, so we're just going to look at how to build this out sort of bare bones. Let's go ahead and create the project. All right, and similar to what happened in GitHub, we end up on a page that has a bunch of stuff to help us understand what we're setting up. Uh, it's empty because there are no files added to the repository yet. So just like in GitHub, we made a blank repository. And then the big thing we want to look for down here is how we would push into this repository. And that's going to be based on this little guy right here. There's the address we want to use. So now we've created a GitHub repository and a GitLab repository. And we have, from the previous episodes, a local Git repository. How do we make them wired up so that the data in our local repository can be pushed up to both of these remote systems? Let's take a look. Okay, so here we have the repository that we've been playing around with for the last couple of episodes. We've learned to use Git locally and we have everything working the way we want. But we're ready to push this stuff up to GitHub and GitLab, and we just made those repositories, right? So how do we get them there? Well, we're going to have to add remotes. The first thing we can do is a git remote command, and it's going to return nothing because we don't have any remotes yet. So if we go back to our GitHub, we can see the URL here that it wants us to use if we're going to connect to it. And we'll go back to our editor and we'll do git remote add. Now we have to give it a name. So in this case, I'm going to call it GH for GitHub. And then I'm going to paste that in. And now we can see that git remote will return that we have one remote called GH. Now let's do the same thing for GitLab. We'll go over here, go to our GitLab window. This is the address we want to use. You can see, oh wait, I almost got caught by that. In GitLab, they try to default you to SSH, but I'm going to use HTTPS for simplicity's sake today. That allows me to just grab a regular HTTPS URL and I don't have to worry about setting up SSH keys. It's obviously the less secure way to handle this. And if you're going to do extensive work in GitHub or GitLab, you should probably consider setting up SSH keys. I may try to cover that in a later episode, but it can be a little complex, and so I'm not going to take the time today. Today we just want to see things flow. So I'm going to grab the GitLab URL here. You can see it starts with HTTPS, so that means I'm ready to go. Go back over to my Visual Studio and we'll do git remote add, and this time I'll do GL, and then we'll paste. Okay, so now we've added both of the remotes to our Git repository, and we can see that with git remote, and it'll tell us that we have a GH and a GL. So we're ready to do some code pushing. The cool part is, because both of those repos are empty, that means we're actually ahead of them on our local, and we can do an instant push. We don't have to add any new commits or anything to make this work. So what I'm going to do is git push. Now the push command requires two extra parameters. I have to tell it which remote I want to push to, and I have to tell it which branch I want it to push. So I'm going to push to GitLab, and I'm going to tell it I want to push main. And so when I do this, GitLab and VS Code know that they need an authentication. And it's requiring me to add in my username and password so that I can push to GitLab. So I am Link Benjamin there, just like I am at GitHub. And the password I will type in, and there we go. We actually see a successful push. So what you see down here is we've created a new branch called main in the s3e4 Git repository in GitLab. So let's go over there and see what it looks like now. So here's the page that I was on, and if I refresh this, I now have my files up to date. Now notice that the git ignore actually worked for us because I didn't push up credentials.txt. That was important. We didn't want that to be a part of the git repository. So this is your verification that it's actually ignoring that file. Git is not paying attention to it at all because it's been told to ignore it. It does push up the git ignore because it wants that configuration data to be available regardless of where you are. And it pushes up the README. And so there you have it. You now have code pushed to GitLab. Now if I go back to VS Code and do the same command, but let's change that GL to a GH, git push GH main. Because I was already authenticated with GitHub, I've already set that up prior because that's my primary space that I use. It's already pre-configured in my browser. And so if I come over here and refresh this page, I now have the same thing in the GitHub environment. So now I've created two copies of my code, one in GitHub, one in GitLab, where I can go do any sort of collaborative work that I want within the space. Now you might be asking yourself, Blink, why in the world would you set up GitHub and GitLab on the same project? The answer is it's just for the purposes of showing you that you can do both and see what the differences are. It's only in the case where we're evaluating the tools and looking at what they do. Generally speaking, you pick one place for your repository to live, and that becomes sort of the home base, and then you let people clone off of it to make changes to it. So it's not usually necessary for you to have one in GitHub, one in GitLab. Now, if you're really paranoid about the idea that you might lose some data, you might consider putting it in both places and then manually maintaining the synchronization between them to make sure they always both have the latest. That seems like it's a little bit overkill. GitHub and GitLab, neither one loses our data. They're good companies that are solid and they have good business plans and they're holding their own in the industry. It's not like we have to worry about them going away overnight. So it really is kind of overkill to have two remotes in this way. But the point is, you can actually do that. And it could be that you are in the middle of a transition. Maybe your company was working with GitHub and they decided to transfer everything to GitLab or vice versa. So you would need the ability to do this dual remote thing temporarily while you're in the process of migrating. That might be something you would consider. But generally speaking, this is not how you set up your project. Typically, there's just one remote out there someplace, and that is going to be sort of the home base for everything that happens. You make your changes, you submit them back to the home base, and that becomes the place where they're all collected into one big project. So the next question we might ask is, what does this look like if we were actually starting from scratch and not having to do this initial push up from a local machine into the cloud? If I was starting a brand new repository that was fresh, what would I do? Well, let's take a look at the GitHub version. We'll come over here and we'll do a new repository and we'll do s3e4-2. And in this case, we will do a README. We will do a git ignore. We'll make it Python. That's one of the cool features of doing it this way, that in GitHub, it will pre-populate your git ignore with a lot of the things that are commonly excluded from certain programming language environments. So that's really helpful if you're just trying to get things rolling fast, that it tries to do that. And then, of course, the license, we'll pick the MIT license. It's usually very permissive, easy to make things shareable. So there we go. We create a repository. And now we've made this s3e4-2. All right, Let's go over to GitLab and we'll do the same exercise. We will create, oh, that's not what I wanted. We have to get out of the project. Here we go, and we'll go to a new project, create a blank project. We will call this s3e4-2. We will use the same personal namespace. We will again select no deployment target. We will keep the README this time. What are the, oh, there's a hashing algorithm. Okay, so GitLab only offers the ability to add the README. It doesn't do ignore files or anything like that as something that it automatically sets up. I believe that could be configured, like there may be plugins and things you can add to your GitHub or your GitLab space, but it's not done by default. So we create the project here, we have it, it exists. Okay, and so we would have the option to clone with SSH or with HTTPS, and I'm going to do HTTPS. So let's go back here. What we will do is back up to here and do a git clone of the GitLab one. Okay, and it has now created that. What I need to do is open that folder now. So in here is season 2, and this has the default README. So there you have it. That is how you go through the process. The important thing to note there was how we handled getting the file down. We did a git clone of the repository URL, and that allows us to, that creates a copy locally of a remote repository. So it sort of does the same thing we did earlier, but in reverse, where now we're creating it in the cloud and we're cloning it locally to be able to work on. Once it's created locally here, you can actually see down at the bottom of the screen, we're in a main branch. So it defaults to building a main branch for us. And we can come in here and start making changes and do like, we'll call that one GitLab and make a change. And then we can do commit changing README and git push. And see, because there's already the relationship established and there aren't multiple remotes, we can simplify the git push to just say push, and it knows I'm on main, I'm pushing main, and I know what branch or what remote to push to because it's the only one that exists. And there you have it. So now that change should have actually made its way into our README. And you can see it now says -GitLab on it. So just like that, we've been able to engage with a cloud-based solution. The commands are exactly the same for GitHub. I won't necessarily walk through them today. That could be a little boring. But you go grab the URL for GitHub and you clone it. You'll notice that I actually probably made a boo-boo in this, that I named both repositories the same thing, which when it creates the folder locally, it's going to have a collision if I put them both in my projects directory together. Then what I should have done is name them something separate so that they wouldn't collide with each other. But that's neither here nor there. The short version of this is that you can get clone from here the same way you can from GitLab, and they will work the same way. That's one of the beautiful things about using Git in this manner is it doesn't matter if you're using GitHub or GitLab, the Git commands always work the same way. Okay, I think that's a wrap on this adventure of Blink. This is, of course, your reminder. Click that like button if you found this useful or helpful. That helps me understand what kind of content to bring you in the future. And if you haven't done it already, click that subscribe button as well, because that way you won't miss any of the upcoming episodes and you'll be able to stay right alongside us. Now, I have had so much fun with this. I hope that you've learned a lot today, and I can't wait to see what you build with it. We'll see you next time.